This is World Report. Good morning. I'm Marcia Young. Canada's inflation rate dipped last month. Statistics Canada just released their latest consumer price index report. It shows a decline of 0.3% from February, which is a surprise to some economists. CBC's senior business correspondent Peter Armstrong has more.
These inflation numbers look back at an economy that was so different in so many ways from the one we live in today. Back then, we were still trying to figure out whether Donald Trump would actually go through with his threats to undo the global trade order. Some tariffs were imposed, but quickly granted exemptions and workarounds were provided. So the drivers of prices then were the end of the federal GST holiday, for example, and, the falling price of gasoline. And surprisingly, price growth cooled considerably. Economists were expecting to see an acceleration in March, and that slowing gives the Bank of Canada more wiggle room than expected. The central bank meets tomorrow to decide what to do about interest rates. Most believe the bank wants to cut rates and stimulate the economy, but was worried about inflation. After these numbers, it obviously has a little bit less to worry about. Peter Armstrong, CBC News, Toronto.
Honda may be looking to move some of its Canadian automotive production to the United States. That is according to a report today from a Japanese news outlet. The report says the company is considering the move in response to the Trump administration's tariffs. But Finance Minister François-Philippe Champagne says he has spoken with a senior Honda official, and he says, at least for the moment, it's not clear that Canadian production will be affected. Last year, Honda announced plans to build a multi-billion-dollar electric battery plant at its auto plant in Alliston, Ontario. The federal and Ontario governments committed $5 billion to that project. The tariffs and international trade are the top priority for some Alberta farmers, and they're thinking about that as they consider who to cast their ballots for in this federal election. The CBC's Madeleine Cummings has more from Edmonton.
Climbing into his tractor, grain farmer Shane Stridehorst is just a few weeks away from seeding fava beans in his fields northwest of Edmonton. With most Canadian pulses exported and a global trade war unfolding, he's worried.
What we really need is a government that's going to be willing to grow our international markets.
He says some farmers are considering swapping canola for barley in response to Chinese tariffs on Canadian canola oil. Fellow grain farmer Ron Kryko says he's voting Conservative, hoping Pierre Poilievre can break down trade barriers.
I think a lot of the farmers are just frustrated with what's been happening, and they want to change.
Kryko wasn't a fan of the carbon tax.
I don't know why you would tax something that is a necessity.
And even though Liberal leader Mark Carney got rid of the consumer carbon tax, that didn't win him over.
Well, they've had 10 years to prove themselves to be a worthy government.
Though international trade is top of mind for these grain farmers, it's not as important to Michael Verhoeven. He's the head grower at High Q Greenhouses and on the board of the Alberta Greenhouse Growers Association. He says since most industry growers sell to Canadian clients, they have different priorities.
Business management strategies the federal government has, like Agri-Stability, Agri-Invest, that they should be modernized and that they should be maintained.
All three farmers say they haven't heard agricultural issues discussed much during the campaign so far. Madeleine Cummings, CBC News, Edmonton.
All party leaders are in Quebec today campaigning ahead of tomorrow night's French language debate. Liberal leader Mark Carney is announcing that if his party forms government, it would launch a mid-career training benefit.
This approach will support Canadians in the middle of their careers who need access to skills training within established areas of critical need for our economy.
Carney identified those areas as manufacturing, construction, technology, and artificial intelligence. He says the benefit would provide up to $15,000 per Canadian for training. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre says he would implement new laws to protect Canadian seniors from scammers.
We're going to pass the Stop Scamming Seniors Act, a common-sense law that forces banks and telecom companies to deploy state-of-the-art technology to catch scams and stop them before they happen, not after, when it is too late.
Poilievre says this plan will require mandatory scam detection systems for banks and cell phone companies, as well as mandatory prison sentences and fines for those convicted.
1 in 3 Sudanese, as we speak today, are displaced. 1 in 6 internally displaced persons globally come from Sudan.
A grim statistic from the UN's Mamadou Diane Baldi, a regional director for East Africa. Today marks the second anniversary of Sudan's civil war. Canada and 20 other countries are meeting in London to address the crisis. As Idil Musa tells us, Sudanese Canadians say Ottawa is slow to bring refugees to Canada.
I contacted the Canadian High Commission in London within days of the war breaking out.
Canadian Sami Atabani is desperately trying to get his sister and her 7 children out of Sudan. He applied to Canada's family-based pathway program in hopes of getting them to safety, but the cap on applications had been reached.
Women are particularly vulnerable. She has a 12-year-old daughter.
Atabani has reapplied to bring them to Canada, but he's frustrated with the time it's taking.
I haven't heard anything. Why is there no urgency?
The United Nations says the conflict has sparked the world's largest displacement crisis, affecting nearly 13 million people. And the U.S. Special Envoy for Sudan says estimates suggest as many as 150,000 people have been killed. Kate Hickson is with Amnesty International USA.
We've seen in other instances where governments have moved very quickly to help with those who need to seek safety elsewhere to reunite with their family, and we don't necessarily see this with Sudan, and so there needs to not be that double standard.
More than 40,000 Afghan refugees came to Canada after the Taliban took over Afghanistan in 2021, and 300,000 Ukrainians were admitted after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So far, just over 700 people from Sudan have settled in Canada under the federal government's family-based pathway program. Idil Musa, CBC News, Toronto.
More Canadian permanent residents are complaining about being stranded abroad. Last week, we told you about a woman who had her permanent resident card stolen in the UK. She fought for weeks to be allowed back into Canada. Now several others have told CBC News similar stories. The CBC's Elise Skora has more.
Puna McMullen lost her permanent resident card while vacationing in Mexico and then got turned away at the airport.
I have a British passport. We're part of the Commonwealth. Why can I not come back to Canada?
And she's been living here for more than 2 decades.
I just can't believe they didn't even let us come back to the freaking country.
Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada then approved her application for an emergency travel document. It sent her to TT Services run by VFS Global. Canada contracts the company to help non-citizens. It took McMullen's passport so that it could return it with a temporary visa inside. Then McMullen and her husband waited in Mexico. Days became weeks, 4 weeks to be exact, all while racking up expenses.
I'd say about 40.
That's $40,000. A few months later, Wei Yu's PR card was stolen in the same country, and he also dealt with VFS Global.
No updates. I called daily. No one knew where my documents were.
After 3 weeks, Yu took matters into his own hands. He reached out to VFS Global executives on LinkedIn and got his passport sent out the next day, but not before missing something important back in Montreal.
I was actually scheduled for my citizenship test.
CBC reached out to VFS Global to find out what's behind these delays. It told us only the Government of Canada can control processing times or prioritize urgent applications. IRCC could not give CBC a response by deadline, but Yu says he did eventually get to take his test. Elise Skura, CBC News, Ottawa.
A moose migration is really something to see, and now may be your chance, thanks to a hit Swedish show. You can watch the majestic beasts during their annual spring migration to greener grazing pastures. The 20-day, 24-hour live stream has become very popular in Sweden. Last year, they reached 9 million viewers. The migration and the live stream began a week ahead of schedule this year because of warmer weather. Remote cameras will capture the moose at every step of the way during their 300-kilometer journey northwest of Stockholm. And that is the latest national and international news. From World Report, I'm Marcia Young.